off the top of the show that I was in court last week, Zoom court, WebEx court. It's what it is here in Alberta. And I was covering the cross-examination of our Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Deena Hinshaw, on some of her orders and some of her decisions. And God love these lawyers that went through 400 press conferences that she held. And at one point, she kept insisting that her restrictions were used sparingly and sparsely. That was the phrase she kept using. And she also insisted at one point that churches were never closed to in-person worship, drastically restricted, but never actually closed. And that was a really untrue thing for her to say, given that while she was on the stand, the anniversary of the 1 year of the fence going up at GraceLife Church ticked over. And that was when the church itself was snatched by the government for 90 days, and the congregation, they're driven underground. Their pastor previously had spent 35 days in jail, James Coates, for simply not imposing the government restrictions on a congregation that didn't want them. If you wanted to social distance inside of GraceLife Church, you could. You wanted to wear a mask inside of GraceLife, you could. You wanted to obsessively wash your hands inside of GraceLife, also fine. But he wasn't going to make anybody do it. And in fact, he said that it violated his religious freedom. And by limiting the church capacity, it violated his call that, you know, based on his interpretation of theology, to not forsake the in-person gathering of the congregation. And while Deena Hinshaw said that, the anniversary ticked over. And I remember I took so many pictures of those signs on the GraceLife fence, and before the fence went up, on the GraceLife door, signed by Deena Hinshaw. The order was signed by her to do that, and yet she testified no churches were restricted to in-person worship.
That seems a lot like contempt of court to me. You know, it's not only that, it's they literally snuck in the early morning hours at Fairview Baptist Church, Pastor Tim Stevens' church, and changed the locks. They literally, they gated one, they locked another one, they closed the churches. And then furthermore, every single church was so limited in capacity that it's like, well, we let 5 of the, at my old church, 16,000 congregants attend at a time, or 10 or 50. Costco was half of capacity or whatever it was. But these churches with all these safeguards in place, measures in place, that were far more interested, a pastor far more interested in the care of his flock than Costco cares about random people coming in and shopping. They apparently could not be trusted. It's wild. The other thing that I noticed that ticked around was Ramadan. And last year, during these arrests, during the highlight of these arrests, you could drive, and I mean, God bless them. I'm happy that they're able to gather to worship. This is not about, but you could drive immediately to any mosque or any Islamic center within 5 minutes of any of these pastor arrests, and they obviously take their shoes off. You could see hundreds of shoes in the doorways. The parking lot's packed to the brim. The unifying factor here, and one of the things that's going to no doubt be discussed when this sort of unfolds litigiously, you have a vast diversity of personalities. I was talking with Nathaniel about this weekend, in fact. You have Pastor James Coates, Pastor Tim Stevens, Pastor Derek Reimer, and Pastor Artur Pawlowski. I was jokingly calling them the 4 evangelists on the weekend, but they have such distinct personalities. The only unifying factor really is the fact that they're Christian and were targeted for doing as much. Some of them don't have in building, like Pastor Derek Reimer. The majority of his stuff is sort of online and then on the streets, outdoors. He sometimes has sort of small gatherings with friends, but he doesn't have a massive church congregation. So they weren't just targeting those facilities. Pastor Artur Pawlowski had a relatively small church gathering, and he was targeted for some outdoor ministry. So those two sort of feeding people on the streets. Pastor James Coates and Pastor Tim Stevens very much having more standard church facilities, having varying degrees of support, and certainly allowing people to participate. But there was a wide array of people and a wide array of compliance or non-compliance, depending on the case, with restrictions and how they were implemented. And the unifying factor between all of them is the fact that they were Christian. Other denominations doing worse I say worse per the terms of the government, not per my personal opinion. No one dared look there. Even Deena Hinshaw said, well, they have received some reports, but when they went and checked it out, everything was fine. Well, it took all of 20 minutes of sleuthing to do a quick lap to the other religious communities in the neighborhood to see that there was indeed packed facilities and no enforcement whatsoever, which again, I'm saying good. I don't want any groups targeted by the government. People should be left alone to worship.
Yeah, they could have. I mean, not that I would want it, but the RCMP were literally stationed at GraceLife on the road, blocking the roads, in the church parking lot sometimes. That didn't happen with other religious groups.
No.
Not that I would want to see it, but I'm just pointing out the inequity of the treatment here. I noticed something over the weekend. James Coates, pastor at GraceLife Church, he's got a brand new book, and he wrote it with Nathan Busenitz. He is also a pastor at I think it's John MacArthur's church. So Grace Fellowship. I just want to make sure I get it right. John MacArthur's church. Yeah. Grace Community Church in Sun Valley, California. So one is a church plant of the other. Pastor James Coates did exactly what John MacArthur did and not close his church to comply with the government. But somehow Alberta was more tyrannical than California. And I think that has a lot to do with the strength of the American Constitution versus the Canadian one that is limited, has reasonable limits. Well, what's a reasonable limit on your freedom? I certainly don't want a politician deciding that for me, but in Canada, that is the case. So James Coates wrote this with Nathan, who's on the pastoral staff at Grace Community Church in Sun Valley, about the church versus God, the church versus government. And this is exactly what James Coates said all along. It is our duty as Christians to obey the government, except in such times that the government is no longer being biblical. Like, we should obey laws that say, do not murder, do not covet, do not steal. Those are laws, and so many of our laws come from biblical origins. Most of our laws come from the 10 Commandments. But when you are faced with, do I obey the government or do I obey what I know to be commanded by God? You must always choose God. And so it details their battle, this new book. And John MacArthur, they took on the state of California and they won. Basically, the law said you cannot impose limits on a church that you didn't impose on Walmart, which actually makes perfect sense. But that wasn't the case here in Alberta.
Well, I want to urge people to check out the conversation that I had with John Carpe specifically on this. And we talked about how the American legal system, some states have independent constitutional courts, but the reason the United States moved beyond this so much faster than us is, one, they actually had private healthcare and they have like 5-to-1 ICU beds, so they're better able to cope and deal with people becoming sick should they become sick. But two, their judicial process is actually a tangible process that isn't just madness. Like, you don't wait 2 years for a health officer to be on the stand justifying what they've done once the restriction's already over. It could be to the extent that there's an intentional shortage and defunding of the courts so that they're unable to deal with so much of this stuff, because as John Carpe said in that interview, it's 2 years versus 2 weeks to get something addressed. And the sane sort of legal precedent would be, well, we don't take action. We're not going to stifle. If there's a 2-year delay, we're going to lay away these restrictions until they can be justified. Unfortunately, in Canada, they've taken the opposite approach. And they're like, we're going to leave all these clearly charter smashing and defying restrictions in place until 2 years from now when Deena Hinshaw isn't on vacation. She's willing to sort of show up on stand. It still matters, because if there is a ruling from this court saying the government moving forward has to justify in court any actions they take because they did violate people's rights, it could prevent in November or whatever them from bringing all the restrictions back. It could be a valuable tool, but we shouldn't face 2 years of trampling of our freedoms and rights, still being unable to travel within this country without any official ever having to show up, because you can use any justification. There's always some crisis in the world. If it's not real, it's manufactured, like Jyoti Gondek with this emergency crisis in the city, this climate crisis. But there's always going to be some sort of crisis to justify taking our rights away. And as we'll get into it here, but Dr. Leslyn Lewis said the Emergencies Act, every time, she said this over the weekend, it was used, it was abused.
Oh, hey guys, thanks for watching. That's a clip from our Rebel News Daily Livestream where we talk about the news of the day in an unscripted and interactive way. It's co-hosted at noon Eastern or 10 Mountain Standard Time by me on Monday, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. And on Wednesdays and Fridays, we've got rotating co-hosting happening from some of our other on-air talent. So good news, there's something for everybody. We broadcast on YouTube. But if you want the full uncensored version, you're going to have to find us on Rumble, Super U, and Odyssey. And be sure to sign up for our rebelnews.com emails so that you never miss us when we go live.